Marcus Thompson adjusted his worn military jacket as he walked through the crowded shopping mall. The fabric had seen better days, with small tears along the sleeves and faded patches where bright colors once proudly displayed his service record. At 62, Marcus moved with the careful steps of a man whose knees remembered every mile he had marched in combat boots across foreign soil. The jacket meant everything to him. It was not just clothing but a piece of his identity, a reminder of the 25 years he had dedicated to serving his country. Each patch, each pin, each faded stripe told a story of sacrifice, brotherhood, and honor that most people would never understand. The jacket had traveled with him through 3 deployments, witnessed the loss of good friends, and carried him through the darkest moments of his military career. But to the group of teenagers lounging near the food court, Marcus looked like nothing more than an old man wearing outdated clothes. They spotted him from across the walkway, their eyes immediately drawn to his military attire. Whispers and snickers began to ripple through their group as they pointed in his direction. "Look at that old guy," one of them said loud enough for others to hear. "Who still wears those ancient military clothes? Doesn't he know the war ended like forever ago?" Another teenager, emboldened by his friend's comment, raised his voice even higher. "Hey, old man, did you get those clothes from a thrift store? They look like they belonged to someone's great-grandfather." The group erupted in laughter, their voices carrying across the busy mall corridor. Other shoppers began to notice the commotion, some glancing at Marcus with curiosity, others looking away uncomfortably. The teenagers seemed to feed off the attention, growing bolder with each passing moment. Marcus felt his face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to keep walking. He had learned long ago that fighting every battle was not worth the energy, especially not with children who had no understanding of what his clothes represented. Still, their words cut deep, reopening old wounds that never seemed to fully heal. "Maybe he thinks he's still fighting a war," another teenager called out, causing another wave of laughter. "Someone should tell him the costume party ended." The mockery continued as Marcus made his way toward the department store. He needed to pick up a few essentials, but now all he wanted to do was complete his shopping and leave as quickly as possible. The joy he usually felt wearing his military jacket had been replaced by shame and frustration. As he entered the store, Marcus could still hear the teenagers laughing behind him. Their words echoed in his mind, making him question whether he should continue wearing the jacket that meant so much to him. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was time to pack away the memories and dress like any other civilian his age. The department store was quieter than the mall corridor, offering Marcus some relief from the harassment. He moved through the aisles, methodically, picking up the items on his mental list while trying to push the teenager's comments from his thoughts. The familiar weight of his jacket on his shoulders usually brought him comfort, but now it felt heavy with the burden of judgment from others. Other shoppers in the store seemed to pay him no attention, which Marcus appreciated. He had always been a private person, preferring to go about his business without drawing attention to himself. The military had taught him to be observant and aware of his surroundings, habits that had never left him even in retirement. As he stood in line at the checkout counter, Marcus noticed an elderly woman ahead of him glance back at his jacket. Instead of mockery, however, her expression showed what appeared to be respect and recognition. She offered him a small nod and a gentle smile before turning back to complete her purchase. The brief interaction reminded Marcus why he wore the jacket. It was not for the approval of others, but as a way to honor the men and women he had served alongside, many of whom never made it home. Each time he put on that jacket, he carried their memory with him, keeping alive the bond that had been forged in the crucible of military service. After completing his purchase, Marcus steeled himself for the walk back through the mall. He hoped the teenagers had moved on to some other form of entertainment, but he prepared himself mentally for the possibility of facing their ridicule again. The jacket might be old and worn, but it represented something far more valuable than fashion or contemporary style. As he approached the mall corridor, Marcus could see the group of teenagers still gathered near the food court. They had grown larger, with a few more young people joining their circle. His heart sank as he realized there was no avoiding another encounter with them. The teenagers spotted him immediately as he emerged from the department store. Their conversation stopped abruptly, and all eyes turned toward him. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares as he began walking in their direction, knowing he had to pass by them to reach the mall exit. "There he is again," one of them announced to the group. "The walking museum exhibit." The laughter resumed, but this time it seemed more vicious, more pointed. Marcus kept his eyes forward and continued walking, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing how their words affected him. He had faced far worse challenges in his life, but somehow the casual cruelty of these young people felt particularly painful. What Marcus did not know was that someone else in the mall had been watching the entire situation unfold. Hidden among the other shoppers, this observer had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the teenager's behavior. And when this person got a closer look at the insignia on Marcus's jacket, everything was about to change. The stage was set for an encounter that would transform not only Marcus's day, but potentially teach the group of teenagers a lesson they would never forget, about respect, sacrifice, and the true meaning of the uniform that one old man wore with quiet dignity. Daniel Rodriguez had been shopping with his wife and young daughter when he first noticed the commotion near the food court. At 38, Daniel carried himself with the upright posture and alert awareness that marked him as military, even in civilian clothes. His trained eyes immediately picked up on the situation developing across the mall corridor. He watched as a group of teenagers began targeting an older man in what appeared to be a military jacket. Daniel's jaw tightened as he witnessed their cruel laughter and mocking comments. Having served 2 tours in Afghanistan himself, Daniel knew the significance of military service and felt his protective instincts kicking in. "Dad, what's wrong?" his 8-year-old daughter Sarah asked, noticing the change in her father's expression. "Just some kids being disrespectful, sweetheart," Daniel replied, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before him. His wife, Maria, followed his gaze and immediately understood his concern. "Should we do something?" Maria whispered to her husband, recognizing the look that meant Daniel was contemplating action. Daniel was torn between intervening and minding his own business. He had always been taught to respect his elders, especially those who had served their country. But he also knew that confronting a group of teenagers in a public place could escalate quickly and potentially ruin what was supposed to be a pleasant family shopping trip. The decision was made for him when the teenagers' behavior became even more aggressive. Their voices grew louder, their comments more cruel, and other shoppers began stopping to stare at the spectacle they were creating. Daniel could see the older man's shoulders sagging with each insult, and it broke his heart to witness such disrespect. "Stay here with Mom for a minute, Sarah," Daniel said, handing his shopping bags to his wife. "I need to go talk to someone." As Daniel began walking toward the group, he tried to get a better look at the older man's jacket. From a distance, he could make out the familiar olive drab color and the general shape of military insignia, but the specific details remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that this was a veteran being humiliated by children who had no understanding of sacrifice or service. The teenagers were so focused on their harassment that they did not notice Daniel approaching from the side. He positioned himself where he could observe both the group and get a clearer view of the veteran's uniform. What he saw when he got closer made his blood run cold and his heart skip a beat. There, clearly visible on the older man's jacket, were insignia that Daniel recognized immediately: the combat patches, the service ribbons, and most significantly, the distinctive unit patches that marked this veteran as someone who had served in some of the most dangerous and classified operations in military history. This was not just any retired soldier. This was a decorated combat veteran whose service record demanded the highest level of respect. Daniel's mind raced as he processed what he was seeing. The patches indicated special operations, multiple combat deployments, and service in conflicts that most people only read about in history books. The faded ribbons represented medals for valor, distinguished service, and sacrifices that few would ever be called upon to make. But what struck Daniel most profoundly was a small, almost invisible patch near the jacket's left pocket. It was the kind of insignia that most people would overlook, but to someone with Daniel's background, it was unmistakable. This veteran, had served in units that operated in the shadows, taking on missions that would never be fully declassified, protecting freedoms that these teenagers took for granted every single day. The irony was overwhelming. Here were young people, enjoying the safety and security of a peaceful shopping mall, mocking the very person whose service had helped make their carefree existence possible. They had no idea that the man they were taunting had probably seen and done things that would haunt their nightmares. Daniel felt a surge of anger mixed with profound respect. He had served with men like this veteran, had seen firsthand the courage and dedication required for such service. The idea that anyone would mock such a person was not just disrespectful, it was a betrayal of everything the military stood for. As he watched the veteran continue walking despite the ongoing harassment, Daniel noticed something else that made his admiration grow even stronger. The older man was not responding to the taunts, not engaging with his tormentors, not allowing their ignorance to provoke him into an unseemly confrontation. He was displaying the same discipline and self-control that had undoubtedly served him well during his military career. But Daniel also saw the pain in the veteran's eyes, the way his proud shoulders had begun to slump under the weight of the teenager's cruelty. This was a man who deserved to walk with his head held high, proud of his service and the sacrifices he had made. Instead, he was being forced to endure public humiliation from people who had never sacrificed anything for anyone. The teenagers continued their harassment, seemingly energized by the veteran's lack of response. They interpreted his silence as weakness rather than strength, his restraint as an invitation to escalate their cruelty. Their laughter grew louder, their comments more vicious, drawing even more attention from other shoppers. Daniel knew he had to act. This was not just about defending one elderly veteran, it was about standing up for the principles and values that both he and the older man had sworn to protect. It was about teaching these young people that actions have consequences and that respect is not optional when dealing with those who have served their country. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped forward and began walking directly toward the group of teenagers. His military training kicked in, and he adopted the confident, authoritative bearing that had served him well during his own service. He knew that what happened next would determine whether this situation ended with education and understanding, or escalated into something far more serious. As he approached, Daniel caught the veteran's eye for just a moment. In that brief exchange, he saw recognition pass between them, the unspoken understanding that exists between those who have served. The older man's eyes widened slightly as he noticed Daniel's purposeful approach, and for the first time since the harassment began, a glimmer of hope appeared on his weathered face. Daniel approached the group of teenagers with measured steps, his expression serious but controlled. Years of military training had taught him the importance of projecting authority without aggression, and he called upon that experience now. The teenagers were still laughing and making crude jokes about Marcus's appearance, completely unaware that their behavior was about to be challenged. "Excuse me," Daniel said in a clear, firm voice that cut through their chatter. The authority in his tone immediately caught their attention, and the laughter died away as they turned to look at him. The teenagers seemed surprised by the interruption. They had been so focused on their target that they had not noticed Daniel's approach. Now they found themselves facing a man who was clearly not intimidated by their group dynamic and who carried himself with unmistakable confidence and purpose. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel continued, his eyes moving from one teenager to another, making sure each one felt the weight of his attention. He positioned himself slightly between the group and Marcus, creating a protective barrier without being obvious about it. "No problem, man," one of the teenagers replied with false bravado, trying to maintain the casual tone they had been using moments before. "We were just having some fun, nothing serious." "Fun?" Daniel repeated, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "You consider mocking an elderly veteran to be fun?" The word veteran hung in the air like a challenge. Several of the teenagers shifted uncomfortably, beginning to sense that their entertainment was about to become something much more serious. A few of them glanced at Marcus's jacket with new attention, as if seeing it for the first time. "We didn't know he was a veteran," another teenager offered weakly, though the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. We were just joking around about his old clothes. Daniel's expression hardened. Those old clothes represent 25 years of service to this country. Every patch, every ribbon, every insignia on that jacket was earned through sacrifice and dedication that you clearly cannot comprehend. Marcus stood quietly nearby, watching the exchange with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. He had not expected anyone to come to his defense, especially not another veteran. The humiliation he had been feeling began to transform into something else, a renewed sense of pride in the uniform he wore and the service it represented. "Look," Daniel continued, stepping closer to the group and lowering his voice so that only they could hear him clearly. "I want you to take a very close look at this man's jacket. I want you to really see what you've been mocking." Despite their earlier bravado, the teenagers found themselves following Daniel's instructions. Something about his demeanor made it clear that this was not a request, but a command. They turned their attention to Marcus's jacket, this time with more serious intent. Daniel pointed to specific patches and ribbons as he spoke. "This ribbon here represents the Bronze Star. That's awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in combat. This patch indicates service in Vietnam, where this man fought in one of the most difficult conflicts in American history." The teenagers grew quieter as Daniel continued his explanation. The casual cruelty they had displayed moments before was being replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of what they had actually been mocking. "And this insignia," Daniel said, pointing to a small patch that most people would never notice, "indicates service in special operations. This man was part of units that took on the most dangerous missions, operations that most of us will never know the full details of because they remain classified to this day." One of the younger teenagers in the group began to look genuinely ashamed. "We really didn't know," she said quietly. "We just thought he was some old guy wearing weird clothes." "That's exactly the problem," Daniel replied, though his tone was slightly gentler now. "You saw an elderly man and decided he was fair game for your entertainment. You never bothered to consider who he might be or what he might have done with his life." Marcus stepped forward then, his voice quiet but steady. "It's all right, son," he said to Daniel. "They're just kids. They don't understand." But Daniel was not ready to let the moment pass. This was an opportunity for education, a chance to help these young people understand the cost of the freedoms they enjoyed. "With respect, sir, that's exactly why this conversation is important. They need to understand." He turned back to the teenagers, his expression serious but no longer angry. "This man and millions like him volunteered to serve their country. They left their families, their comfortable lives, and put themselves in harm's way so that you could grow up in safety and freedom. While you've been worried about homework and social media and weekend plans, men and women like him have been standing guard, making sure that the worst things in this world never reach your doorstep. The freedoms you exercise every day, including the freedom to mock strangers in a shopping mall, exist because people like him were willing to sacrifice for them." The group had fallen completely silent now. The reality of their behavior was beginning to sink in, and several of them looked genuinely uncomfortable with what they had done. The laughter and casual cruelty had evaporated, replaced by an awkward understanding of their mistake. "I served in Afghanistan," Daniel continued, "and I can tell you that every day over there, we thought about home. We thought about the people we were fighting to protect, people like you. We believed that our sacrifice meant something, that the country we were defending was worth the price we were paying." Marcus watched the exchange with growing emotion. He had spent so many years carrying the weight of his service alone, never expecting recognition or thanks, but always hoping that somehow his sacrifices had mattered. To hear another veteran articulate those feelings so clearly, and to see these young people beginning to understand, was deeply moving. "So when you mock a veteran," Daniel concluded, "you're not just insulting one person, you're dishonoring every person who ever wore a uniform, every family that ever waited anxiously for their loved one to come home, and every sacrifice that was made to preserve the way of life you enjoy." The teenagers stood in stunned silence, the full weight of their actions finally becoming clear to them. What had started as casual entertainment had become a profound lesson in respect and understanding, and they were beginning to realize that their behavior had been far more serious than they had imagined. The silence that followed Daniel's words was profound and heavy. The bustling sounds of the mall seemed to fade into the background as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. The teenagers stood frozen, their earlier confidence and cruel laughter replaced by a growing sense of shame that was written clearly across their young faces. Marcus felt something shifting inside him that he had not experienced in many years. The crushing humiliation that had been weighing down his shoulders like a heavy burden was slowly beginning to lift. In its place, he felt a familiar warmth returning, the renewed sense of pride in his service that had been dimmed by years of indifference and occasional mockery from a society that seemed to have forgotten what his generation had sacrificed. To have another veteran stand up for him, to have someone truly understand the deep meaning behind his worn and faded jacket, was more healing and restorative than Marcus could have ever imagined. It was like having a piece of his soul returned to him after years of feeling invisible and forgotten. One of the older teenagers in the group, a lanky boy with sandy hair who had been among the loudest and most vocal in his earlier mockery, stepped forward with obvious hesitation. His face was flushed bright red with embarrassment and his voice cracked and trembled slightly as he struggled to find the right words. "Sir," he said, his eyes fixed directly on Marcus with newfound respect, "I want you to know that I'm really, truly sorry for what we said. We honestly didn't stop to think about what your jacket actually meant or what it represented. We were just being incredibly stupid and thoughtless, and there's no excuse for that kind of behavior." Marcus studied the young man's face carefully and saw something there that gave him hope. Genuine remorse and regret, not just embarrassment at being caught. The anger and hurt that he had been carrying in his chest began to soften around the edges. This was a teachable moment, he realized, not a time for continued anger. "What's your name, son?" Marcus asked gently, his voice kind but still carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect in very different circumstances. "Tyler," the teenager replied, his eyes cast downward in shame. "Tyler Morrison, sir." "Well, Tyler Morrison," Marcus said with growing warmth in his voice. "We all make mistakes in life. Every single one of us has said or done things we later regretted. The most important thing isn't the mistake itself. It's what we learn from it and how we choose to behave differently in the future." Another teenager from the group, a girl who appeared to be about 16 with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, stepped forward with visible tears beginning to form in her eyes. Her voice was quiet and shaky as she spoke, but her words carried the weight of genuine emotion. "My grandfather was in the military," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "He died when I was really little, but my mom always talks about how incredibly proud she was of his service and how he never really talked about what he went through overseas. I should have remembered that when I first saw you. I should have thought about how I would feel if someone had treated my grandpa the way we just treated you." Daniel watched this exchange with a deep sense of satisfaction and hope. This was exactly what he had been hoping would happen when he decided to intervene. Not just a quick apology to make the situation go away, but genuine understanding and real reflection on the part of these young people. They were making the connection between their actions and the real consequences, seeing how their thoughtless behavior affected not just Marcus, but represented disrespect toward everyone who had ever worn a military uniform. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud to know that you learned this important lesson today," Marcus told the girl with genuine warmth. "Military families understand sacrifice and service in a way that others sometimes cannot fully grasp. You carry that understanding in your blood and in your heart, even when you might forget it for a moment during everyday life." The transformation in the atmosphere around them was truly remarkable to witness. What had started as a hostile and painful confrontation was evolving into something much more meaningful and powerful. The teenagers who had been laughing and pointing and making cruel jokes just minutes before were now listening with rapt attention, their faces showing genuine interest, respect, and deep remorse for their earlier behavior. More teenagers began stepping forward from the group, each one offering their own personal apologies and explanations. Some talked about family members who had served in various branches of the military. Others simply acknowledged their mistake with honest shame and promised earnestly to do better in the future. The casual cruelty and thoughtless mockery that had characterized their behavior was completely gone, replaced by respectful attention and what appeared to be genuine remorse. I never really stopped to think about what all those patches and ribbons actually meant, admitted one of the younger boys in the group, his voice carrying a note of wonder. I just saw old, worn-out clothes and thought it was funny somehow. But now I'm beginning to understand that they're like medals or awards or something important like that, right? They're much more than just medals or awards, Marcus explained with infinite patience, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher who genuinely wanted his students to understand an important lesson. Each patch, each ribbon, each small insignia tells a specific story about my service. This particular patch here represents my unit during my deployment in Vietnam. These ribbons show the different military campaigns and operations I participated in over the years. This small insignia that most people would never even notice indicates specialized training that took many months of intensive work to complete. Every single piece of this jacket represents time, sacrifice, dedication, and service to something much bigger than myself. As Marcus spoke, more shoppers in the mall began to take notice of what was happening. Word seemed to be spreading through the corridors that something special and meaningful was taking place. Instead of the mockery, stares, and uncomfortable glances that Marcus had been forced to endure earlier in the day, people were now approaching the growing group with obvious respect and genuine gratitude. An older woman who had been shopping nearby and had witnessed the entire transformation approached the group. She had been watching from the very beginning, first with clear disapproval at the teenager's cruel behavior, then with growing admiration as Daniel stepped in to intervene, and finally with deep respect and emotion as she witnessed the remarkable change taking place before her eyes. "Excuse me," she said to Marcus, her voice carrying years of love and loss, "but I couldn't help but overhear everything that's been said here. My husband served in Vietnam too, during some of the worst fighting of that conflict. He passed away 5 years ago after a long battle with cancer, but I know in my heart that he would have been deeply honored to meet someone like you today." She reached into her purse with slightly trembling hands and pulled out a small American flag pin, its red, white, and blue enamel still bright and vibrant despite its obvious age. "He wore this on his jacket every single day for 40 years after he came home," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He always said it reminded him every morning of what he had served to protect and defend. I think he would want you to have it now." She pressed the small pin into Marcus's weathered and calloused hand with a gentle smile that spoke of decades of love and respect. Marcus felt his eyes welling up with tears that he had not shed in years. The simple gesture, combined with everything that had happened during this extraordinary afternoon, was almost overwhelming in its power and meaning. The pin was still warm from being carried close to the woman's heart, and he could feel the love, respect, and memory it represented flowing through the small piece of metal and enamel. "Thank you so much," Marcus managed to say, his voice thick with emotion that he could no longer hide or control. "This means more to me than you could possibly know or understand." Daniel continued to watch as even more shoppers began to gather around their impromptu group. Several other veterans who happened to be in the mall that day, recognizing the military insignia on Marcus's jacket and drawn by the growing crowd and the obvious respect being shown, came over to shake his hand firmly and share brief but meaningful stories of their own service experiences. It was as if Daniel's decision to intervene and speak up had opened a floodgate of respect and recognition that had been waiting to pour forth. The cruel mockery had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful, a genuine moment of connection between generations and a powerful lesson in respect, understanding, and the true cost of the freedoms that everyone present took for granted every day. A mall security guard who had been observing the situation from a respectful distance finally approached the group. Daniel tensed momentarily, concerned that they might be asked to move along or break up their gathering because of crowd control issues. Instead, the guard, a middle-aged man with the unmistakable upright bearing and alert awareness that marked him as someone who had served in the military himself, extended his hand to Marcus with obvious and deep respect. As Marcus continued sharing his stories, the small circle of teenagers had grown into a larger gathering of interested listeners. Shoppers paused their errands to hear about his experiences, and several pulled out their phones, not to mock or record for entertainment, but to capture what had become an impromptu history lesson from someone who had lived through significant moments in American military history. "I enlisted right out of high school in 1979, Marcus explained, his voice growing more animated as he settled into his role as storyteller. Back then, the world was a different place. The Cold War was still very real, and those of us in the military knew we might be called upon to defend freedom in ways that people today can hardly imagine." Tyler, the teenager who had been most vocal in his earlier harassment, now hung on every word. What was it like being so young and facing all that responsibility? Marcus smiled at the question. Terrifying and exciting at the same time. When you're 18 years old, you think you know everything about the world. Military service has a way of teaching you very quickly how much you don't know and how much you need to depend on the people around you. He pointed to a patch on his sleeve that showed a ship's silhouette. "This represents my first assignment aboard the USS Enterprise. For 6 months, I lived in quarters smaller than most people's closets, worked 18-hour days, and learned what it meant to be part of something bigger than myself." A young mother with 2 small children had stopped to listen. "How did your family handle your being away so much?" she asked. Marcus's expression grew more serious. "That was probably the hardest part. My wife Karen was incredible. She held our family together during 3 major deployments. My kids grew up knowing that Dad might be gone for months at a time, and they learned to be strong in ways that most children never have to be." Daniel noticed the genuine interest in everyone's faces. What had started as an intervention to stop harassment had evolved into something much more meaningful, a bridge between generations, a connection between civilian and military experiences that rarely happened in everyday life. "The hardest deployment was in 1991 during the Gulf War," Marcus continued. "I was assigned to a special operations unit. I can't go into all the details even now, but I can tell you that we were involved in some of the most critical and dangerous missions of that conflict." He touched a small ribbon near his collar. "This represents the combat action ribbon. It means I was in direct combat with enemy forces. I don't talk about those experiences often, but I want you all to understand that freedom isn't free. Every generation has been called upon to defend it, and some have paid the ultimate price." An elderly man in the crowd spoke up. "My son served in Iraq. He came home, but he was never quite the same. How did you handle the transition back to civilian life?" Marcus nodded knowingly. "That's one of the most difficult challenges any veteran faces. When you spend years in an environment where every decision could be a matter of life and death, where you depend completely on your brothers and sisters in arms, coming back to civilian concerns like traffic jams and grocery shopping can feel surreal." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I was lucky to have a strong support system, but not everyone does. That's why when I see veterans struggling, whether they're dealing with invisible wounds or just trying to find their place in civilian society, I try to help however I can." Sarah, Daniel's 8-year-old daughter, had wiggled free from her mother's grip and made her way to the front of the crowd. She looked up at Marcus with wide, curious eyes. "Mr. Veteran, were you scared when you were fighting the bad guys?" Marcus knelt down to her level, his weathered face softening as he addressed the child. "I was scared sometimes, sweetheart. But you know what? Being scared doesn't make you weak. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid." "My daddy was in the Army," Sarah announced proudly, pointing back at Daniel. "He says it's important to help people." "Your daddy is absolutely right," Marcus replied, glancing up at Daniel with appreciation. "And today, your daddy helped me by standing up for what was right. That's what good soldiers do. They protect people who need protection." The crowd had continued to grow, and Marcus noticed that several other veterans had joined the circle. An older woman wearing a Vietnam veteran's family member pin stepped forward. "Thank you for sharing your stories," she said. "My brother never made it home from Vietnam, but it means a lot to hear from someone who served during that era and came back to tell about it." Marcus stood up and took her hand gently. Your brother's sacrifice mattered. Every person who served, whether they came home or not, contributed to the freedoms we all enjoy today. When you honor his memory, you honor all of us. Daniel watched as the atmosphere in the mall corridor had completely transformed. What had begun as a site of harassment and humiliation had become a place of respect, learning, and connection. The teenagers who had started the incident were now among the most attentive listeners, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in understanding Marcus's experiences. One of the teenage girls raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Thompson, do you ever regret joining the military? I mean, with everything you had to go through? Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. I won't lie to you. There were times when it was incredibly difficult. Times when I missed my family so much it hurt. Times when I lost friends who were like brothers to me. Times when I questioned whether the sacrifices we were making really mattered. He looked around at the faces surrounding him. Young and old, diverse in background but united in their attention to his words. But looking at all of you here today, seeing young people like you taking the time to listen and learn, knowing that the freedoms you enjoy were protected by the service of people like me and countless others, no, I don't regret it. Not for a moment. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause and several people called out, "Thank you for your service." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of respect and gratitude. Just an hour earlier, he had been considering whether he should stop wearing his military jacket in public. Now he felt more proud of his service than he had in years. As the applause died down, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion that he had not experienced in many years. The circle of listeners began to gradually disperse, but not before many of them approached him personally to shake his hand, offer their thanks, or share their own connections to military service. Tyler, the teenager who had led the initial harassment, lingered after most of the crowd had moved on. He appeared to be struggling with something he wanted to say. Finally, he approached Marcus with obvious nervousness. Mr. Thompson, he began, his voice shaky with emotion. I need to tell you something. My older brother enlisted in the Marines last year. He's currently in basic training at Paris Island. When I think about how I treated you today, and how someone might treat him when he's wearing his uniform, his voice trailed off as the full implications hit him. Marcus placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. Your brother is lucky to have you looking out for him. The fact that you can make that connection shows you've learned something important today. The next time you see someone in uniform, whether they're active duty or a veteran like me, you'll remember this moment. I want to write to my brother about what happened today, Tyler said. I want to tell him about meeting you and learning about what military service really means. Maybe it will help him during training to know that people back home understand and appreciate what he's doing. Marcus smiled warmly. I think that's a wonderful idea. And Tyler, if you ever want to bring your brother by to meet me when he comes home on leave, I'd be honored to share some of my experiences with him. Tyler's face lit up with gratitude and excitement. Really? That would be amazing. He's always interested in hearing from veterans who served before him. Daniel, who had been watching the exchanges with deep satisfaction, approached with his family in tow. His wife Maria and daughter Sarah had witnessed the entire transformation, and both were visibly moved by what had taken place. Mr. Thompson, Daniel said, extending his hand, it was an honor to meet you today. What happened here was exactly why I served, to protect the freedom of good people like you to wear that uniform with pride. Marcus gripped Daniel's hand firmly, feeling the bond that instantly forms between veterans. Son, what you did today reminded me why I'm proud to have worn this uniform. You didn't have to step in, but you did because it was the right thing to do. That's the spirit that makes our military strong. Maria Rodriguez stepped forward with little Sarah. Thank you for sharing your stories with us, she said. It's important for our daughter to understand the sacrifices that people like you have made for our family. Sarah looked up at Marcus with the directness that only children possess. Mr. Marcus, will you be my friend? My daddy says it's good to have friends who are heroes. Marcus felt his eyes mist over as he knelt down to Sarah's level once more. I would be honored to be your friend, sweetheart. And remember, heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Your daddy is a hero, too. As the Rodriguez family prepared to leave, Daniel pulled out his phone. Mr. Thompson, would you mind if I gave you my contact information? My daughter would love to hear more of your stories sometime, and I think it would be good for her to have a connection to military history that goes beyond textbooks. I'd like that very much. Marcus replied, genuinely touched by the offer. I don't get many opportunities to share these stories with young people who are interested in hearing them. The mall had returned to its normal busy atmosphere, but the area where they stood still felt charged with the energy of what had transpired. Other shoppers continued to nod respectfully at Marcus as they passed, and several store employees had emerged to express their appreciation for his service. The teenage girl who had mentioned her grandfather approached Marcus one more time before leaving. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to call my mom tonight and ask her to tell me more stories about my grandpa's service. I realize now that I never really listened when she tried to share them with me before. That's wonderful, Marcus replied. Those stories are precious gifts. Every veteran's experience is unique, but we all share the common bond of having served something greater than ourselves. Your grandfather's stories deserve to be remembered and honored. As the crowd finally began to thin out, Marcus found himself standing with just Daniel and his family. The transformation from the morning's humiliation to this afternoon's celebration felt almost surreal. His worn military jacket, which had been a source of shame just hours before, now felt like a badge of honor once again. You know, Marcus said to Daniel, I was actually considering putting this jacket away permanently. The looks I get sometimes, the comments from people who don't understand, it had started to feel like more trouble than it was worth. Daniel shook his head firmly. Sir, with all due respect, that would be a tragedy. This jacket tells a story that needs to be told. The patches, the ribbons, the insignia, they represent experiences and sacrifices that shape the world we live in today. Don't let the ignorance of a few people silence that story. After today, I don't think I could take it off if I wanted to, Marcus replied with a chuckle. I feel more proud to wear it now than I have in years. As they prepared to part ways, Tyler reappeared with several of his friends. Mr. Thompson, he said, we were wondering if maybe you'd be willing to come speak at our school sometime. I think a lot of kids our age need to hear what we heard today. Marcus was surprised and deeply moved by the request. I'd be honored to speak at your school, Tyler. It's exactly this kind of conversation that helps bridge the gap between generations and helps young people understand the sacrifices that preserve their freedoms. The security guard who had approached earlier returned with a small American flag that normally flew outside one of the stores. Sir, he said to Marcus, the store manager asked me to present this to you as a token of respect and gratitude. He's a veteran himself, Air Force, and he wanted you to have something to remember today by. Marcus accepted the flag with trembling hands. The simple piece of cloth represented everything he had fought for throughout his career, the ideals, the freedoms, and the country he had sworn to protect and defend. This has been the most meaningful day I've had in years, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. When I woke up this morning, I never could have imagined that a trip to the mall would restore my faith in the younger generation and remind me why I'm proud to be a veteran. Daniel smiled as he watched the elderly veteran clutch the flag. Sir, you've given these kids something they'll remember for the rest of their lives. You've shown them that behind every uniform is a real person with real stories and real sacrifices. That lesson will stay with them forever. As the afternoon wound down and people began to go their separate ways, Marcus stood for a moment in the mall corridor where everything had changed. The jacket that had made him a target for mockery had become a catalyst for understanding, education, and connection. He thought about all the veterans who didn't get moments like this, those who faced ridicule or indifference without anyone stepping in to defend them, those whose stories went untold, those whose sacrifices went unrecognized. Today had been special, but it had also highlighted how rare such recognition had become. Walking toward the mall exit, Marcus felt the familiar weight of his military jacket on his shoulders. But now it felt different, not heavy with burden but solid with purpose. He would continue wearing it, continue sharing his stories when opportunities arose, and continue serving as a bridge between his generation of veterans and the young. people who would inherit the freedoms he had helped protect. The teenager's cruel laughter had been transformed into respectful attention. A stranger's intervention had become a lasting friendship, and what had started as one of the worst days, in recent memory, had become one of the most meaningful. Marcus Thompson walked out of that mall with his head held high, proud once again to be a veteran and grateful for the reminder that his service had mattered. In the end, the worn patches and faded ribbons on his jacket had done exactly what they were meant to do. They had told his story, honored his service, and connected him to others who understood the true meaning of sacrifice. And thanks to one man's courage to speak up, and a group of teenagers' willingness to listen and learn, that story would continue to be told for generations to come.